All right, guys, it's 6 p.m. Welcome to our second episode of ATA Talk. ATA Talk is all about discussing fresh ideas, innovative thoughts, solving problems, treading on uncharted waters, or learning something which is important in today's scenario. And in the process, we want to create a larger community of thought leadership. This ATA talk allows everybody to attend, first of all, and we want everybody to be a speaker as well. In this time's the second episode, we have basically 69 responses, and out of which basically 84% are from the testing community, and 18 or 19% odd people said that they want to be speaker. So I am inviting all of you to basically send in your speaker topics on what you want to talk about, and we would be welcoming you all in this edition. Okay. This episode 2, we have our wonderful speaker Sundaresan Krishnaswamy. He is going to talk about API testing, evolution of modern API, and automation techniques. Sundaresan is a very humble guy. He is being part of the ATA volunteering committee, and he is part of the core committee for our conference organizing team, which has been organizing conferences for past many years. Sundar has been part of many events in past 2 years, and he's basically a very dedicated volunteer. Apart from it, he is a test architect, test strategist, a mentor, a speaker. He works for IBM. He's a seasoned testing professional with over a decade of hands-on experience in delivering quality products with the right set of tools, processes, and frameworks. He has helped organizations scale by building teams, training, mentoring, and establishing a brand for the QA. I would like to basically welcome Sundar for taking over the discussions ahead. Let me unshare the screen, Sundar, and it would be all yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the introduction, Aditya. Um, it's always a really great experience to be part of ATA, to host the ATA conferences as well as meetups. One thing I'm really proud about an ATA, uh, being a part of the ATA community is that we are very consistent in what we do, be it meetups, sharing our knowledge, inviting speakers, unique speakers who can actually share their knowledge, and also kind of propelling the software, the thirst for quality in the software industry is something that ATA as a organization has been doing really well. And as a core committee member, I'm really proud to be a part of this group. So once again, thanks a lot, Aditya, for inviting me for this session, and I hope I can do some justice to this evening hour. And thanks a lot, participants who have joined now. Let me just take you through the journey of the evolution of the modern API. We have been discussing a lot about APIs. There's going to be an API summit as well that's coming up in ATA. So having said that, let's kind of walk down the memory lane as to how did this all come about? How did the whole API revolution started? And then maybe we'll just go over a couple of automation techniques and how to get there to become a really good API automation engineer. So API is ruling the world now, so there's no doubt about it. But let's get into that by kind of deep diving into the history. Having said that, this next slide is about me, and this is something that my friend Ajay Balamurgadas has always been saying, that you gotta have a slide about yourself, dude, if you're presenting. I just thought I'll just start this with some sort of self-deprecating humor about myself. So I'm a quality freak and I'm a test architect at IBM, like what Aditya introduced. I love to break things and build from scratch. No wonder I got into testing and also kind of driving the automation. I worked on pretty much every technology except rocket science, so it is easy for me to say that, to use the phrase at work, that it is not rocket science. Although I love tennis, I do not play. And then I'm kind of catching up on all the books that I wanted to read, especially during this pandemic. I'm really looking forward to kind of discuss the upcoming slides with an awesome audience like you. So let's get started. The question is, hey, when I say walk down the memory line, it's about history, right? But why history? And especially history about APIs, and APIs is basically data, right? So imagine that if encyclopedias were accessible only in your neighborhood library, how would life be? I'm not sure about the new millennial generation, the Generation Z, but the previous generations actually had to go to a library to kind of access encyclopedias, to access information, or even for that matter, to read a daily newspaper. So we are now living in an extraordinary world with a large repository of data, right? Anything that you want to know, you just go search for it and you get it. Be it an encyclopedia or be it information about a particular topic or a subject or an object or anything that you want, right? Anything that you want, it's available as data. And you query for information almost every day, every second, right? You want to order something on Swiggy, you just query for that particular restaurant or maybe even for the particular item, things like that. But at the same time, you want to buy something, maybe you go to Amazon and search for it, right? You query for information, and that thirst for information has actually been growing phenomenally. So the question that we'll have to ask ourselves is how this whole journey came to be, and then how do we kind of understand this journey so that we'll be able to build better ideas, better solutions. The web that we see today is not the same, right? Some of us have lived through the ages of Netscape and Internet Explorer 1 and 2 versions before we started adopting some of the latest in terms of Chrome browser or Firefox for that matter, right? The same way, the web was not built in a day. I mean, there's several technological innovations that has happened in the last 30 years, right? It took several ideas and several iterations. There are a lot of RFPs that were actually iterated again and again to build the standard that is required for the web, right? And then these ideas can actually help us further research and also development. Okay, I hope you can actually see my slides changing.
Yes.
Thanks. So a lion's roar cannot be heard 5 miles away, but sorry, a lion's roar can be heard 5 miles away, but at the same time, you cannot hear it unless you live in a jungle, right? I'll come to this point a little later, but I hope I'm actually trying to make some point that there is some sort of communication. The communication can happen when you fine tune yourself and listen to it. Here is one interesting video. It's a very diplomatic video, nothing political about it, and I hope we'll have some learning at the end of it.
Prime Minister Modi, President Putin said the other day that Russia does not engage in state-sponsored interference with other countries' elections. Do you believe that?
У Дадона спросите, он знает.
You are talking about America, Germany, and Russia. You talked about President Trump, about Mrs. Hillary Clinton, about Chancellor Merkel, and about President Putin. You've been talking of such big people today. I don't think that you don't need a lawyer like me in between all of you. We never need more lawyers.
Да, не тут-то было, с индусами непросто.
Yes, it's very hard to deal with the Hindu. You cannot trick them because their philosophy is so long. We are simple people, we say what we think.
Okay, that's an interesting diplomatic encounter. And the point that I want to make here is that the channels or the languages that were spoken were actually diverse, right? There's someone who's speaking in Hindi, which is of course our Prime Minister, and then President Putin was talking in Russian. But then the common language that actually brought them together and made this video watchable is English, right? The same way today, the data that is actually on the web is actually it's in multi-dimensional, it's in multimedia, and it's in multiple languages. And then we'll have to, and it is also built using multiple technologies, different technologies. But we need one single standard way of communicating between these technology stacks, the technology services, as well as the languages and other mediums and medias that are available on the web, right? So yeah, I hope this sets an example as to, hey, while there is data, but there is also a need for us to kind of have one standardized way to take the data forward for the user consumption. Okay. So how did this data evolve over the last several years? First, it's kind of started as a file storage. I don't know how many of you have actually seen a floppy disk or even for that matter, the old hard disk. But I'm sure some folks would have actually seen the IBM hard disk, which was about 40 MB, if I'm right. So first, it started with file storage. Data has to be transferred using a medium like a disk from one system to another. And then the networks evolved. The networks were internal, external, which is intranet, and then to an extent over a wired network, which could be external. And then there was ARPANET and different communication mediums that were actually created so that the network can be expanded between two organizations or within the same organization, but over telephone connections or something like that. There was no proper internet at that point, but the internet was evolving. Then the communication kind of expanded once internet was established. A common entity was set up, and then this common entity kind of rolled out the internet throughout the globe. So that way, the sizable amount of data started coming up online, and a sizable amount of data was actually also transferred online. And then came the static web. The static web basically, but previously the data was more or less an email communication, or maybe they used to send files over a particular group or medium. I don't know if you guys know about the discussion forums that used to be there before, which was not on the web, but on its own platform, through which you can actually even send files or even have discussions and all that. So then came the static web, where there were HTML pages where there was some information, like let's say news or portals where different data was actually analyzed and things like that. Yeah, I think Yahoo was a portal which visit before, where it had information, directory services, and several other services, which was more or less static and more or less accessible. And then there was also email. Then came the web application, and today we are seeing a truckload of web applications that are coming up. Right, a web application started with as simple as an email application over the web. So say, for example, Hotmail was one of the web applications that were actually exposed to the public, right? And today we have everything that we see on the web is actually a web application. It's not a static web anymore. Then came the mobile application sometime around the 2006 to all the way to 2020, we saw the mobile applications actually evolving. And then now we see the IoT devices being adopted across everything that surrounds our life. So say, for example, there are vacuum cleaners, there are refrigerator applications, microwaves, which can actually talk to you over the internet. There are home light bulbs that talks to you over the internet. And then robotics have been evolving a lot, which is also connected now, right? It's also connected. There's also data that is being transferred by the robotics applications or the robots. And there's also web-based bots which actually make decisions and also help users with different sort of information, right? And what I do see is the future belongs to neural nets, and most of you would have, I mean, it's been evolving over the last 20 years, but the neural nets are going to be the future, where there is no centralized thinking repository, but the data is spread everywhere, but the decision making is done collectively, right? And I'm sure everyone would have actually seen the deep learning, what is that, computing that Google developed, and which has been a revolutionizing. Sorry, is there someone who needs to go on mute?
Sundar, let me try to mute.
Thanks. Yeah, so neural nets are going to be the future, where the data that you get will definitely be used for a better decision making. And deep learning is one such neural network which is already active and has been helping a lot, especially in different facets of our life. Okay, so how did the web evolve? Of course, the World Wide Web was the first one, which kind of started the client-server based architecture. And then to kind of communicate between the client and server, we kind of used HTML, and the HTML itself evolved over a period of time, and we have a lot better HTML versions. With HTML5, you can actually write your JavaScript applications, and it's much more dynamic than what it is to be before. Initially, there was only one-way communication, which is basically the client will actually request the server and then be done with it. But now there's also a two-way communication. The server can actually ping back to the client or a browser, and the client can also request at any point in time. So at a very later stage, around 2000s, early 2000s, we started seeing two-way communication between the client as well as the server. Previously, it used to be like one-way communication at any point. Then the other data communication system that I'm not sure how many of you would know deeper into a OS-based processing system, but this will actually kind of help you understand how things work today. And I'm going to give you a few examples. So there used to be, and there is, of course, OS-based inter-process communications, where there are events and calls between applications. Say, for example, an email application will kind of communicate with a server. It will frequently poll the server to get some information. Or the email application will actually connect to your calendar, and the calendar application may connect to the date and time process that is there on the computer or the laptop, where whenever there is, so basically the calendar application will subscribe to the date and time, and then when a particular time occurs, for example, the time management or the date and time system that is there on the PC or the laptop will actually send an event back to the calendar, so that the calendar can actually maybe send a reminder to the user or something like that. So this was basically an inter-process communication that actually started with the operating system, and then to an extent that evolved into a queuing and publishing and subscribe kind of tokenized system. So this has also kind of evolved really well. So the systems that you work with, especially Kafka or Apache, Pulsar, all these are messaging systems which has evolved over a period of several years. First, what started as an OS-based interprocess system within the laptops and PCs became something phenomenal, and then it became queuing systems where messages can be communicated between two servers, or events can be actually processed between two different services that are there. So, I mean, the use cases are endless, right? So that's how the messaging systems evolved over a period of time. And then there was, and there is remote procedure calls, which is basically a program-to-program communication over network. A laptop can actually talk to another laptop through an RPC call, and it has to be over a network. And it was kind of a client server, so to speak, but it can also be a P2P communication. In case if there is an app, say for example, there used to be a broadcast app which is very famous in Windows. I'm trying to recall the app's name, which actually uses RPC to kind of message between two laptops without having to go on the internet. So such apps used to use RPC, but now RPC has actually become a client server. A communication protocol as well. So you would have known about gRPC, where the binary data gets transmitted over the internet between a server, or between two servers, or between the server and maybe even a mobile app. So gRPC is evolving and is also getting adopted. So yeah, this was the systems in the late 1990s, where we had the World Wide Web. We were also evolving messaging systems within OS, because OS was also becoming multi-threaded, and also with Windows coming in, where you can use multiple Windows windowing systems, or basically multiple applications on the same PC. So these messaging systems had to evolve. And then once the networks evolved, then we had to kind of communicate between two laptops or two computers in the network. So that's where the RPCs also came into picture. I hope everyone is with me so far. So we saw HTML. HTML was basically these base for static websites. But how many of you knew that there were no forms when the whole World Wide Web started? Forms were actually introduced later, much later, maybe around the 1997 to 98 timelines. So only when the forms came into picture, then things became a little more dynamic than what it was. But then the communication was kind of haphazard. I could design a form and I could send data in whichever way I want and whichever format I want. So the internet group, the ICANN and other consortiums, basically they came up with a standardized data interchange format, which is XML, which is an extensible markup language. It's a protocol-based language which runs on top of TCP/IP, and it later became the de facto exchange format for APIs. And then XML kind of helped build SOAP, right? SOAP is also API protocol which was developed earlier. And then SOAP was actually used to kind of build a standard interface between the distributed system. And SOAP had something called it still has something called the WSDL, Web Services Description Language. And this WSDL is a very simple metadata of XMLs, which can be on the server and which can be copied on the client side as well. And it was used for communication between the client and the servers. And SOAP also helped convert existing objects into services. And SOAP was used for multiple reasons. One is, of course, the client-server communications, but also communications between apps in PCs. And then basically, SOAP was very complex. It used XML it used XML to actually request an XML. So you had to write a boatload of what is that request to get a response from a server or maybe even an application. And it was not something that was suited for mobile applications. So it was, I mean, XML is a very expensive data format to parse, and especially on mobile devices where you need to save computing power to save the battery. XML is not recommended for parsing because it takes more time and more resources to parse. Although it may be very negligible in few milliseconds, but still it matters, especially on mobile, right? SOAP is basically simple object access protocol. I forgot to expand the abbreviation. Here's a simple SOAP request. Like I was saying, the request itself is kind of messy because you need to write a header in XML format, the body, and you'll have to basically envelop this into one big XML, send it, and then basically get it back, get the request back or the response back, and then you'll have to parse it and do something with it. Right? So it's very expensive to construct something as a request and get back. Again, I hope everyone is with me when I say request and response, right? When I say client-server communication, it's all about a client basically requests something to the server, and it requests in a format that the server understands, and then it actually gives back the response. So the XML standard is something like English, where no matter what application that runs on the client device, the standard is English, like we saw in the diplomatic incident video. English is the standard, and XML is the standard in terms of the technology that we have. And then XML was used as a standard protocol to a standard markup language to kind of communicate between the server and the client. So the client requests the server using an XML request, and the server responds back with an XML so that the client also understands. But behind the scenes, the mobile application can use anything, as well as the server can use anything in terms of technology stack. The common communication medium has to be XML, which is akin to the English language that we saw in the other video. So I hope now I can connect the dots between the video and what we are seeing here. Okay, now let's move on to RESTful APIs. We saw some of the drawbacks of SOAP. SOAP is very expensive and it's very messy, especially if you want to start using it over a network, right? So the companies Salesforce and eBay, they released around, this is early 2000s, where they released APIs intended for desktop tools. Say, for example, if you're bidding in eBay, there were a lot of desktop tools which can actually help you for decision making. So they released APIs for desktop tools, which basically returned XMLs during that time. Now we have evolved. We don't use XML much. We use JSONs because JSONs is very easy to kind of use in any programming languages, as well as it takes very less time to parse. So it's much more easier to use on the mobile devices. So having said that, yeah, in those days, I mean, Salesforce and eBay kind of exposed public APIs, which actually returned XMLs when a request was made. And then came the JavaScript enhancement. The hero is XML HTTP request. It was also called Ajax. I mean, not just the XML HTTP request. Ajax has a lot of commands, of course, but this kind of became the game changer, where when there is a change that is there in a part of a web page that you're looking at, you do not have to actually reload the entire page. So one key application actually implemented it, and which you may be using on a day-to-day basis, which is Gmail. Gmail first introduced or leveraged the XML HTTP request, which came with JavaScript. And so one of the best things that happened was that you don't have to press the refresh button on your browser to get the latest email. You just have to keep that browser window open, and then whenever there's a new email, it magically adds the new email to the list of emails that are there already. So this continuous polling happens behind the scenes without you having to refresh. Right? So that kind of changed the whole game, and then there was a flood of applications that started using those Ajax-based tools to make refresh much more easier and faster. And then we see a lot of JavaScript frameworks since then. JavaScript has evolved like anything. So whatever you see on the web today, even this presentation application that I have in front of you is built on top of a JavaScript framework by this company called Beautiful.ai. So there is React.js, there's Angular, and there's Vue.js. There's so many JavaScript frameworks that has come, and that has completely changed the way things happen. So now, when you have a whole application on your website, or on basically on a website, right? When you have a whole application, you will have to get the data from somewhere, right? So your application cannot keep querying the servers to kind of build the data and show it on screen. So they need some way to communicate, and that's where the RESTful APIs came into picture, where the front-end application will actually query the APIs and then parse this data and then show the different data on your screen. So the advent of REST APIs, like we saw, happened with fewer changes to the JavaScript, especially with Ajax coming into picture. The real advent happened a little later, especially in terms of REST. REST is basically, API requests that you make in a very stateless format. Basically, you make a request to the server returns a response. After that, there is no connection between your client and the server. REST works on top of HTTP or HTTPS. So it's a very common communication medium, so it makes it much more easier to query the server. And then basically you can make the REST APIs public at any point, right? So an API can be something that can actually communicate between the client and the server, but it can also be something that can communicate between a server to the server, right? So having said that, let's say you are custom building or you're purpose building APIs, you can also build APIs for the public to consume and do something with it. And mostly when I say the public, it's usually the developers of a different application. And then, REST APIs actually also implemented authorization and control so that the APIs are much more secure. It can actually give the data only to those that are authorized, and it just doesn't give away the data for anybody who kind of queries them. And then the best part came with REST APIs, which is you could actually start building mobile applications pretty quickly with REST APIs. Unlike SOAP, where you have to do a lot of constructs, REST APIs, you just have to query a particular URL, maybe with a few parameters, and you're done getting the data that you want. And maybe you will also have some sort of authorization if it is a secure mobile application. So that's really how the REST evolved. But what are the motivation that kind of made the whole industry move to REST? The basic HTML forms, and this is a very interesting thing, the basic HTML forms actually had the get and post as a common verb which you use to query the web. What happened was get could actually handle anything. Basically, there were no error scenarios in get at that point. So say, for example, if I want to delete somebody, I can just call something like this, forum.com user, and remove is equal to ID, and then use the get verb to call it, and then the user is deleted, right? Maybe in a forum, and maybe whatever, if it's an application which has sensitive data, you might just go ahead and end up removing them. So that's when REST evolved with different verbs. This was built or kind of conceptualized with different verbs. And then the concept itself became what is that? A test bed to kind of transfer data using different formats, which was XML at that point and now JSON. So REST was conceptualized by Roy Fielding. He kind of introduced the verbs and also kind of gave the standardization that is required to transfer the representations based on the HTTP verbs. The HTTP verbs are nothing but get, post, put, delete, and patch. And the transfer representations could be a JSON, XML, or even an image, or could be anything else as well. So this is how REST came to be. What was a problem with a verb became something that became a complete solution. And with REST came the managed APIs. Managed APIs are nothing but public APIs. So every web app actually exposes APIs. And then with some sort of authorization, access control, and monitoring, you can actually give these APIs to the public, right? And then you can also access through API keys. So now, take for example Twitter or Facebook or Google for that matter. They expose the APIs which are required. Twitter, for example, allows you to post your tweets through APIs, and maybe to read the tweets for a particular handle through APIs. So all this is also controlled through an authorization mechanism, where they give you certain set of authorization, which is usually OAuth, where you also create an application on their server and then get a token and then use the token to further query the APIs. And then there's also access control layer that they added, where depending on maybe if you pay, you may get more access to different APIs, which actually give you more data and things like that. And then also with managed APIs came rate limiting. Rate limiting is nothing but you can query the API only n number of times in a given day, and this kind of work with different sets of conditions. Say for example, if you pay more, you may be able to query more. That could be one rate limit. There's also DDoS attacks. So say for example, I could go ahead and flood the API with millions of requests, which also kind of, rate limited. So maybe if an attack comes from a particular IP or a particular user, then the server starts dropping the request. So rate limiting also kind of helped move to managed APIs. And then also the rate limiters could be implemented on load balancing servers. There are load balancing hardware as well as software. If you've used the middleware like Nginx, it does its own load balancing, as well as there are companies which actually sells load balance servers. So load balancers could not just rate limit APIs, but it could also route requests to different servers based on the load. And then there could be multiple services inside a network, right? Say for example, I may open a product page for a particular phone, and you wouldn't believe there are like at least 6 to 7 APIs that actually runs behind the scenes to get the data for the product page. Say for example, the product availability has to get the data from an inventory API. The product reviews, description, other things may come from different APIs, right? So these distributed services can be different APIs, or it could also be combined into one API and maybe exposed to the public, right? And then monetize API. Google Maps is one classic example of how they monetize API. You pay, and then you get to access more requests per day or even more data per day. And then with managed APIs, API documentation became better. And then a lot of companies started building API dashboard and provisioning UI where you can self-serve. You as a developer or a test engineer can go to that dashboard and then say, for example, in Twitter or Facebook, you don't have to basically what is that, request a support team for your tokens. You can just go to their UI and then create an app, and then it will give you the token. So the API dashboard, provisioning UI, and the documentation for the API became better. And no more web scraping of data. So let's say, for example, if Twitter doesn't expose API, there are no public APIs that Twitter gives. There's no way you can query the tweets and get something out of it. What can you do? You'll have to open a Twitter maybe using Selenium on Chrome, and then maybe you'll have to scrape the data and then get this data and then do something with it, right? That will be tough. So with this managed APIs, it also became much more easier for services to basically expose API through which you can actually give the data using a different network, while the actual users are not impacted because of web scraping and things like that. Some of the benefits of REST, resource access is dynamic. Let's say, for example, you get an email from Amazon or Flipkart for that matter, and which says that you have bought something and there is a tracking URL in it. So this URL is basically dynamically created on the fly. So that makes it much more easier for a developer to kind of generate the links using different what is that, algorithm. They can programmatically generate it and then send it to you. So in the good old days, there used to be a support team which actually used to send the tracking information via email, but now it's not the case, right? Everything is tracked over the web, and the server generates the link, right? And then there is also forward compatibility. So APIs can have different versions. So that way, if I expose an API with additional parameters, additional data in the response as version 2, I can still support version 1 clients, which may not be impacted because I have a new version of my APIs, which has even better data and better handling of things, right? And then you can also reuse APIs across websites. So you have used Uber, you have used Swiggy, you have used different services, and you've always seen Google Maps in it. So basically, what is that? That's an API request and the response that you actually see on the user screen, right, on your mobile screen. So basically, Google has created one set of APIs and then given it to several different developers, and it's used differently in different apps, right? So that's the biggest benefit of APIs, right? You don't have to kind of custom purpose and build different solutions for different developers, right? Say I don't have to build a solution for Swiggy or maybe Zomato. I can just have one Google Map which can actually serve both the different services. So that became a big point. And then a lot of services over the years became mobile first, and Myntra is one example of how they kind of became mobile first and then went back to the web, right? Where there were only APIs and the mobile application. Then you also build APIs for web and use it in the mobile. You don't have to kind of have different data exchange formats, right? You just build one API which gives a JSON response, which is consumed by the JavaScript framework on the web, and then also consume the same JSON response can be consumed by a mobile application on an iOS or Android device. And now every other appliance is actually getting connected through IoT. So I have a Roomba vacuum cleaner which is connected to the cloud. I get a message once it's done cleaning the entire home. How does it work? So the vacuum cleaner connects to the Roomba cloud through APIs, and it ends up sending a report. And in return, when I open the app on the mobile, it hits the same set of APIs or a different set of APIs maybe, and then gives me the information on my screen, right? And then, so yeah, you may have a different set of APIs across different services, but you end up automating the whole thing using a a mobile application or a web application, or you may also query and store this data and then use this data for some sort of decision making. So if you take e-commerce companies, for example, on Big Billion Day, Flipkart basically makes that decision by querying all these APIs from different sources, and then they bring all that together in a system, maybe say for example like Tableau, where they take this data and then make instant decisions based on the sales and other information that they get, right? So yeah, with data and with the responsibility that comes with sharing the data, you also need to secure the APIs. OAuth 2.0, which is the current standard which is used, and previously there was only tokens that were actually given by the API service provider. So you'll have to make a request for the token maybe through a form, or you may have to email them and then they'll send an API token. But now with OAuth 2, it becomes much more easier, where services expose a dashboard or a UI through which you can actually get a token or create a token instantly and then start querying the API quickly. And this also kind of enables single sign-on. So now you use Google to sign into different websites or Facebook to sign into different websites. So all this is nothing but APIs, right? And it uses OAuth 2.0 mechanism to basically provision that the end application as a service provider with Google, and then Google in turn gives the service provider a token, and the service provider can use the token to authenticate you every now and then. And this is the same. For example, if I want to use the Google APIs, I might use the same method where I request for a token and then use that for different services. And then when it comes to data security, different methodologies evolved. So certificate pinning is one complex, but a very, very, useful technology, where you store the SSL certificates on a mobile device or even on your browser, and then you use that SSL certificate for authentication. This kind of prevents man-in-the-middle attack. And then hardware and software-based encryption became possible. And then your code started becoming a source for hackers to kind of understand how your API works, especially when your API is encrypted or uses certificate pinning. So code obfuscation became something that is very vital to kind of save your source code so that nobody else can see it. I'll take one example where Ajay and I was participating in a hackathon where we ended up getting the code from decompiling the code, and then we understood how the APIs work, and we ended up getting a free service with the application. So yeah, code obfuscation kind of makes the code unreadable. And then employee access control, FedRAMP and firewall. So FedRAMP is nothing but how do you actually give control to somebody to access the database, especially your employees. It also dictates how you store the data, what encryption you need to use, and how your network should be, and so several other things. I would encourage everyone to read about it. And then everything went behind a firewall, and firewall technology also evolved along with it. And when it comes to the current or maybe even the future, GraphQL and gRPC, I'm going to ignore gRPC for now, but GraphQL is something that's getting adopted wide in the industry. So how does GraphQL work? So basically, how does GraphQL work? Basically, you query. It's almost like SOAP plus REST, if I can put it that way. So basically, you ask for what you want in your API response. Say, for example, in this case, I want name, height, and mass of a particular hero, and I get a response saying that Luke Skywalker, height, and the weight of the particular hero. And then if I remove it, so this will the top one will be my request, and I'm actually going to make this as a request, and the server will actually give me what I wanted in the response. So SOAP worked like that before. I mean, where you need to give what you want to the server, and the server used to give in the response. The same kind of was kind of mixed into the REST technology as well, and then it evolved as GraphQL. GraphQL is basically a technology from Facebook, and it's widely adopted in the industry because it saves a lot of data, especially over a mobile network, because you request what you want and you get what you want. So especially when the API gives you a truckload of response, maybe running into few KBs, then this really kind of makes it easier. And it also makes it faster to query between different applications or between a client-server application. So let me come to the automation techniques. In the past, there were simple REST client libraries, ready-made JSON loaders, and then we had to write scenarios in CSV files or different other file system files. We need to pre-configure a lot of things before we can even get started with API automation. And the authorization was also kind of hand-coded. We had to write a lot of boilerplate code to do this authorization. But now things are much more easier for everybody. There's Postman, there's REST Issue, there's List Client, and several other clients that are coming up, especially when you want to test or automate your API testing. So there are a lot of pre-baked things that are coming up. There's one more area where things are getting interesting is auto-crawling libraries. And this is especially happening from a contract testing point of view, where the crawlers are basically libraries which actually crawl the code, and they themselves write their test cases for the API request and response, and kind of build an API automation suite just by reading your code. And this is especially useful in a microservice environment where there are thousands of APIs that are written, and then it takes a lot of time for you to automate. So this is an evolving area. I may not have a couple of library at the top of my mind to kind of explain now, but if you search for Pack-based API generation tools, you may end up seeing a few. And the other area where automation is getting interesting, especially from messaging or a data point of view, is gRPC and also messaging queues. I don't know how many teams are actually automating their Kafka or Apache Pulsar test cases, or any other streaming applications for that matter. And then gRPC is also binary based, so how is it getting automated is still a questionable area. But that's an area, if you're looking to kind of learn, is really good to learn now, because it may be the future. So how do you kind of jumpstart your API testing or automation career and become an expert? I would highly recommend you start writing a Flask-based application in Python, which is very easy to learn and very easy to kind of automate, build an API. Here, there is no automation. You're actually basically building APIs. Build a few APIs, and then maybe even build an automation dashboard or a data aggregator for your team. So this will give you an understanding, a deeper understanding of how APIs are built, and then it will also kind of help you later when you start automating the APIs. And write a lot of boilerplate code. This gives you a very fundamental understanding about the system under test. And it also allows to understand how the API will be used by the user interfaces, because the Java application that you see or the mobile application is basically a user interface who is consuming the API, right? And then build an application with the APIs to visualize. Say, for example, you can take maybe if Twitter exposes the API, you build a Twitter application, maybe learning React.js or something. Build a Twitter application and see how that works. And if you are testing your API, you try and be creative and build an application with it. Chances are that you might end up seeing a lot of bugs while you create an application with it, because the end user is also going to create an application, right? And then read and validate the documentation. That's really very important if you want to become a solid automation test engineer. Use Swagger or any other OpenAPI applications to understand the documentation of the API. Some of the recommended Python clients, and the reason why I recommend Python is it makes it much more easier to understand, to build APIs as well as to validate APIs. Some of the recommended Python clients you can actually use for your boilerplate code is like request, HTTP lib2, gRequest, and URL lib3. I have an example code which I'll post it in GitHub shortly, but maybe if I have time, I'll show a quick demo. But before that, let me just go ahead and finish these slides. I think there's only one slide, and I hope so. So yeah, what exactly you need to test in your automation? Look for data integrity and authenticity. The UI basically reflects the data, so your data needs to be correct. If it is incorrect, then or if it doesn't return the right response, then chances are that the UI is going to be messed up as well. So you need to look for data integrity and authenticity of the data, because different servers can communicate with each other and then give a combined data through an API, right? And then test every possible status code and regression. The status codes are like 200, 401, 404, and several different status codes. Especially when you're automating it, the good thing is you don't have to hit each and every time. You can use the automation tool to kind of hit all the status codes to make sure that it returns the right responses for different error messages or different statuses. And also test the contract between services. Service A could be giving data to service B. So understand how the contract works and test the contracts. Test for performance and scalability. Understand the throughputs and the response time that is required from your product owner. How many users will ramp up over a period of time. Work with your DevOps engineer to understand the load balancing infrastructure. And then if it's a public-facing application, especially the APIs are going to be public-facing, look for dates where there could be a spike or and test such cases, especially in your API automation. In terms of security, understand supported authentication types. There could be different types of authentication that an API ecosystem might support. Test for data integrity between servers and clients, and then there could be data leaks in headers and responses. One classic example that I used to give was Flipkart was actually exposing my my mobile number in the API, which was actually an open text API. So chances that anyone can actually look at the API logs and between the mobile and the server, and then go ahead and get my mobile number from it. So test a public API documentation first, because that's what you're actually going to give to the customer. And also look for rate limiting scenarios, which will actually throw a lot of errors. And that's something that you may need to validate as well. So those are some of the API best practices. So APIs have evolved. The web itself has evolved. It started with www, World Wide Web, came with HTML, and then moved to SOAP with XML and other data interchange format. And finally, we have REST now, and hope something else will come. So these are some of the references that I used. So I'll post this PPT through ATA's website, and you can go over this as well. And for automation, use hands-on automation, create APIs first, learn how the APIs are created. So you create it first using Flask. Is very, very easy. Write boilerplate code. I mean, nobody will encourage anybody to write boilerplate code. Use the ready-made libraries is what people will say. But I would encourage everybody to write boilerplate code. That's how you understand where things fail and how your libraries work. And then fail as many times as you can. So this, in summary, what I wanted to discuss about. I think I have a couple of minutes. Maybe I'll just quickly share my Python screen. Okay, so here's a quick API validation suite. It's a very, very simple one. I have used 3 libraries, HTTP lib2, which is basically an API client, JSON, which helps parse JSON, and then there is an asset PI library. So what I'm doing is I'm actually hitting this API called Star Wars API. SW API is basically Star Wars API. If you're a Star Wars fan, please do visit this website to get information about Star Wars via API. So I'm just getting a request and getting the content, and also parsing this content using JSON for the name and the hair color. And then I'm trying to assert the hair color value. And also trying to use, I have another example where I go to this website called GoRest, which authorizes my token. This is basically a bearer token, and gives a container response. And this is pretty much a very small API validation suite. I'm just going to run this, and you can quickly see here the first query, which is get Star Wars people info, gives the info about this particular person. And then get name, it actually got the name Luke Skywalker. I think I'm not printing it right, but anyways, the assertion went through. And then I also try to get this data. It looks like the authorization expired, but it's not giving a right response. It was giving data this afternoon, but for some reason now I don't get the data. Probably the authorization expired, and I do not have any access to the data anymore. So yeah, it's pretty simple, right? Use HTTP lib2, and then you can start writing your own a client, and with the client you can just go ahead and do your JSON validation using different libraries. So yeah, it's quite easy. So the question is, why do you use Postman and rest assured when you can start writing your own code, right? Yeah, so with that, I will stop. I don't know if I have time for questions, but
No, this is wonderful. Sundar, it is amazing. Guys, you have any questions? I think very wonderfully put, if I can say that, because you covered the history and then showed the latest stuff going on, including GraphQL, and then talked about how you can do boilerplate code and all. Amazing, guys. So guys, if you're around and if you want to ask any questions to Sundar, please go ahead. Anyone?
yeah.
Sundar, I have a question. So so REST and GraphQL, right? Too. So how do you compare these two? Or how do you see which one is sufficient in the work that you are doing if the GraphQL is being used?
Okay. So I would answer it a bit ad hoc, and hope you don't mind. In my work, I don't see an adoption for GraphQL at all. Ours is a security application, so the more data that it gets, the better. But I'll take an example of Netflix. Netflix uses GraphQL for their marketing application, where there's a lot of exchange of data between their application on the mobile as well as the Netflix APIs. So with and there are a lot of Medium articles on it, so I would encourage you to read it. So the thing that they say is it not only saved them time, but it also kind of saved them a lot in terms of the network data that they use, and it's much more faster than REST. And the reasons are very simple. You request what you want and you get it. So it makes it much more easier. But what they feel as a pain point, and GraphQL does work. I mean, Facebook uses GraphQL on their mobile applications, right? The pain point is to construct that the resource that you need from the application. That's the biggest pain point. That's some sort of guesswork the developer will have to do, or not a guesswork. The developer should have a complete handle on what exactly needs to be requested for a given scenario, and then get the response. So that's the problem area. But I think folks will get that because Facebook has solved it and has been using it. They know what to request and what the response they need. So I'm sure companies like Netflix and others will also start seeing benefits from it. Netflix has solved it, but they do see that as a little bit of a pain point, especially when you do the design and planning. So yeah, I don't know whether GraphQL will become the future because different application has different context, and based on the context and the use cases, chances are that the architects may choose GraphQL. And like Netflix case, they use it for marketing. They don't use it for their core product. So that itself shows that they are also kind of testing the waters now as to how GraphQL will help them in other different areas.
So there's one more question about from Kannan. How do you validate the API schema? Any
They-
suggestions? Yeah.
Sure, yeah. There are various options to it. So if you're using REST assured for example, and I would go with JSON schema validation. The easiest way to do a schema validation is to kind of generate the schema using your POJOs. There are a lot of different libraries which can actually generate schemas from your Java POJOs. If not, there's one more easier trick that most folks use is that take the JSON response, maybe use Postman or something, and then get the JSON response. There are a lot of JSON schema generators on the web, so just copy paste it on the JSON schema generators. Maybe I can just show you. There are many. So you just copy paste the JSON schema, and then it actually generates a schema from it. And REST assured actually has a schema validator where you'll have to store this schema as a file, and then for every request that you make, you also add this validation in REST assured. So that's one. And also I think Postman also has an option to do your JSON schema validation. So yeah, you can use this trick, or you can also generate schemas from POJOs. I do not know how to do that in Python for that matter, but yeah, it's better to talk to your developer to generate a schema. But on the validation side, REST assured has a solution which you can use, and there are other clients which also has the solution. But if you're writing boilerplate code like me, chances are that you may have to become a little more creative in how to validate this JSON schema. Does that answer your question, Kanan?
Yeah, I think it does. So great stuff, Sundar. Any more questions, guys? So Sundar, I think it was very wonderful. I learned a lot, and I'm sure that whoever basically was part of this ATA talk episode 2 would have definitely learned so many things. So a big round of applause for you, Sundar, for spending so much time and getting things out. I now think that this could have been part of the API summit as well, Sundar. This could, maybe we'll ask you to think about something else and think about the topic as well, so that we can have you back as maybe presenting something, or maybe letting people do some practical stuff with you. Maybe doing a boilerplate code using Python would be a great paper that probably would be very insightful for people like me and maybe others.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try and get something.
Right. Great, guys. So I think thank you so much. Wonderful. Any more questions, guys? Otherwise, we'll like to sign off for the day today with a big round of applause and a big round of thank you from all of us, Sundar. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
It's my pleasure, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.